And you'll all get a prompt. So happy Tuesday and welcome to today's structured conversation, relationship building, SAAL's role in building community among student affairs assessment professionals. So on behalf of the SAAL Professional Development Committee, I want to thank you for participating in today's structured conversation, and an extra thank you to our panelists today. So as you all know, we are committed to involve, feature, and represent diverse perspectives and identities in all our professional development offerings, and ultimately want to meet your needs. And so if you want to share any perspectives, ideas for future topics, I'll post in the chat momentarily where you can fill out a structured conversation form on our website. We'll be using the chat to engage with comments, questions, affirmations, etc. So just in sum, SAAL's history has been due in large part to networking and really the need to build professional development among student affairs assessment professionals. So a group of individuals almost 14 years ago came together with the goal to connect and support one another, and SAAL was born. Networking and building community are fundamental in supporting our colleagues as well as advancement in our field. So today's session will feature former SAAL leaders, founders, and hear in their voices strategies to continue building community within this space. So before we begin, we want to cater our thoughts to our audience. So please take a moment to answer a quick poll that I'm going to launch here. And this question is, which of the following best describes your current primary role? So there's a list of multiple options. You can scroll down. It'll give you some more options. So go ahead and let us know who you are and what represents your role. Awesome. Give folks a few more moments. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end that poll, and I'm going to share the results so you can see who's here today. And it looks like a majority of our folks are student affairs assessments, directors, or coordinators. We have a few in the other and a few not in the higher ed job space. So that should help our panelists cater to where we're going to move this conversation. So let's go ahead and get started with introductions from our panel. Can you each introduce yourself, who you are, and why did you get involved with SAAL? So Darby, can you please start?
Sure, I'm happy to. My name is Darby Roberts. I'm Director of Student Life Studies at Texas A&M University. I've been director since 2013, but I've been in the department since 1998, right after it formed. And so clearly I love assessment and student affairs. It's really fit my professional needs. I also teach in our student affairs master's program. And I also get to write with fabulous folks like Gavin that you'll hear from and present at conferences. But I really got involved in SAAL as one of the founding members way back when we gathered in North Carolina, and there were so few of us. We fit in a small conference room and came together and said, what is it that we need? There's very few of us right now doing this work, but how can we support each other, network, help each other along the way, talk about really important common issues or struggles or challenges or benefits. And that really was how it was born. And I recall one of the things that I volunteered to do was to be the listserv manager for many, many, many years. Doing that is my way to stay engaged, even after those first few years when we got started. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Gavin or Ted. I'll turn it over to Ted.
Yeah, why not? Hi, I'm Ted Elling, former Associate Vice Chancellor for Research and Systems Development at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. I retired about 4 years ago. Prior to that, I had that role in 4 different titles for 28 years. Prior to that, my background was in housing, and I always had departmental level responsibility for assessment. So I go back a long, long way. And I was one of the lucky folks to participate in that small conference room where Gavin fed us, and we had a couple of days of awesome conversation about how we can build a fledgling organization for no resources or very little resources to further the professional development and networking of assessment professionals.
Hi, I'm Gavin Henning. I'm professor of higher education at New England College, which is a small private liberal arts institution in central New Hampshire, where I direct our Master of Higher Education Administration program, as well as our 3 doctoral programs, Doctor of Education programs. And before I became a full-time faculty member in 2012, I spent 20 years in higher ed administration. Similar to Ted, I got my start in residence life and housing, did assessment, although we really didn't call it assessment at that point. I'm really looking at some of the res life survey data because I love data a lot. And then at University of New Hampshire, where I was, they started an assessment office. And so I got to be on the assessment committee, and that really what started my assessment career, and then led the assessment office at the University of New Hampshire and then Dartmouth. And being in that room with Darby and Ted and other folks is really energizing and exciting because there are people I hadn't met before. But I think the seeds of that conversation even went back, maybe even to 2017 or 2007 in Orlando, when I met Ted for the first time and Carrie Zelna at the joint ACPA and NASPA conference. Because I was either chair or chair-elect for ACPA's Commission for Assessment and Evaluation. And we had the opportunity to really begin talking about how do we pull these 2 organizations together. We had folks who were doing assessment and were NASPA members, and folks who were doing assessment who were ACPM members. And a few of us were in both organizations, but it just seemed like we were in silos. And as Darby mentioned, there were so few of us back at that time that we really had to figure out how do we get together and bridge that gap, because there wasn't a lot of information back at that point. We were all just pulling from our graduate work and research methods and trying to apply it into this new world of assessment. And there was really only one book to help us guide that. There were no journals, there was really nothing else. And even in academic affairs, assessment was still emerging. And that was really just focused on the classroom anyway. There were some transferable practices, but it was all, we were kind of like doing this work as we were flying the plane. So we're building it as we were flying it. So having the opportunity to connect and learn what everybody else was doing was really fabulous. And it's really exciting to see how SAAL has evolved since those beginning days in 2008 to where it is now.
First, I just want to say thank you to you all for being here, being present, and just the amazing work that you all invested so early on. I remember when I became a student affairs assessment kind of coordinator leader back in like 2014, I remember Googling student affairs assessment and like obviously coming up with resources that existed, but SAAL became the one resource that I latched on to. So thank you for that. So we're going to kind of head into our next set of questions. We'll start with you, Gavin. So how did your role in SAAL help you build your professional network?
Well, I think it did it a couple of ways. One, it was just meeting people across the country who were doing this kind of work and learning what they were doing. But the other thing that I learned is that being involved in leadership positions gets you connected in a lot of other different ways. And so so it didn't really have to be SAAL. It could have been my involvement in ACPA or CAS or other things. But I got to meet people who did a lot of different work. And then that evolved into, as Darby mentioned, opportunities to write, to present. Ted and I presented on some of the early surveys of SAAL membership. And so it really provided just opportunities that I wouldn't have imagined would happen otherwise. And so just not only being able to learn from each other, but then having these great opportunities to connect and do some work that supports the field was really exciting.
Yeah, and I will echo that and add, it really was important for us to have these common experiences and the ability to have those conversations of I'm in, facing this thing or that thing, and really was a way to develop relationships. And I felt like I could reach out to anyone in those early days too and say, hey, what do you have as a resource on this, or I'm facing this, and really being able to collaborate, come together to support each other. I remember early on, actually, it might have been an assessment conference, one of the early NASPA assessment conferences, where I presented with someone who I had never met in person. And so we had connected and said, hey, do you want to put in a proposal? And we did, and then worked on it, and then came together. And that was the first time we'd actually met each other in person. And I think because of that as well, working with the NASPA assessment evaluation and research knowledge community was another way to network and to be sure everyone was connected how they needed to be connected. And I know that was one of my early connections with Ted as well. thinking about, okay, what is the knowledge community doing? Where is SAAL going? How do we maximize all of our efforts, but be sure that we're bringing people together? So I think that's really it's about building relationships and building that network.
Well, and I can ditto what my colleagues have said. What I think SAAL did for me was what the NASPA knowledge community couldn't do. We were teaching people who were interested in assessment skills, but we weren't finding professional development for ourselves. So when SAAL formed, all of a sudden here was a group of people who were doing the same type of work we did, but did it in very different ways. So there was this insane amount of skills that I couldn't do at my institution that now I had access to through my peers. And that to me was probably the biggest benefit that helped me build my network.
I think what you all are sharing is so pivotal for the field. Like when we come in, it's important to connect with others so we can have a platform to brainstorm and navigate specific challenges. And just even the collaboration piece, I think, is so huge. And we all know, like, higher ed is like, I always say it's like a small village, even though it's vast sometimes. We all experience similar things, and it's important to connect. So moving on to just talking about student affairs assessment as a discipline and as a profession, right? We all, like, the impetus behind our work, we all come from the same background in terms of like why we all want to be in this space and place. So as a student affairs assessment professional, we'll start with Ted on this, is what are some key functioning that network serves for anybody who wants to pursue or in the profession of student affairs assessment today?
Well, let me start off with some humor. When I first got into the business, I got into it because nobody else wanted to do it. So for me, I guess the key functions that work for me for networking is, like Darby had the listserv, I had the membership database, so I got to cheat. So prior to conferences, if I wanted to go into a workshop that had a technology twist to assessment, which was my key interest, I could query the SAAL membership to look at people who might be presenting, go to their website, see what they're doing, so I could then fine tune my attendance at conferences to get the true best practices, not just here's what's cool that we're doing now, but it really would be at the best practice level. Getting advice and continuing my professional development were the other two key networking aspects that I got from SAAL.
And I'll agree with Ted. Actually, I think even today, the people who do assessment do it because nobody else wants to do it. None of us went into student affairs because we love data. We love people. And so a lot of folks don't really like working with data. But I think, as Darby mentioned in a meeting we had last week, student affairs and higher ed is all about relationships, either relationships between people or relationships between data. And so I think that's something that we want to keep in mind. For me, I think some of the functions that really served by some of this network was really just hearing what other people are doing, especially in the early days when I felt like I had no clue what I was doing, and really just kind of going on gut instinct and what I'd learned in my master's program. And also, like, getting support from colleagues. I remember a lot of conversation with colleagues trying to figure out, how do I manage up? Because my supervisor knew nothing about assessment, knew nothing about data, didn't want to know about data. And we really figuring, how do we manage those situations? And then other issues and problems, methodological issues. How do we increase response rates on surveys? How do we do these kind of analyses? All of that stuff and sharing resources were really some of the early benefits of the networking. And then later on is the collaboration piece, the writing, the presenting, and then ultimately developing friendships. So, these professional relationships turned into friendships, and actually it's been hard missing ACP and NASPA the last couple of years because I haven't been able to connect in person with folks. Luckily there's Zoom, because when we started all this stuff, we had, structured conversations were conference calls because we didn't have any video technology back then. And so it's great to have the tools that we have now, but still those in-person connections are helpful.
Yeah, and again, ditto to all that. I will say, so I've been teaching assessment and student affairs for a while. And when I first started teaching, the grad students were like, I don't understand this assessment thing. I don't want to do this assessment thing. I got into student affairs to be relationship oriented and to help students. And probably about, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, I actually started seeing a switch in grad students who actually have come to me and said, I think I might want your job at some point. And so I think there's a little switch, and maybe it's the students who are getting into student affairs. There are a small group of them who are saying, I think that's really interesting. I think I might want to get involved in that. And or they see the benefit of assessment in whatever functional area they go into. And so being able to incorporate that, which I think is something I think about when I think about what I do, is I know a little bit about a lot of things. And then I know the people who also are experts in things where I can say, hey, what about that? Or how did you handle this? Or fantastic questions that come over a listserv and think, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Or, oh, we have worked on this already and let me provide resources. And so I think that has helped. And then I also think as we've developed as a field within the larger profession, that has also helped me on my campus to work with our institutional effectiveness director, because she knows that there is this body of knowledge that we've been able to develop over time, that we're working in partnership, not in an adversarial role or a disrespectful role either. So I think things like that have really helped bring us to the forefront. And I mean, we're still developing, honestly, and some of the great things that have been coming out recently. And you think about all the books and articles and journals that have even come out in the last 5 or 6 years. It's been amazing since when we first gathered in North Carolina and thought, okay, what is it that we're going to do? And this is what it's become.
This is all such great information being shared just about what the key functions are of networking. That I think as humans, sometimes we get so absorbed on our campuses, so absorbed into the role and the profession that sometimes we forget about the human behind that role, right? And it's so important to foster that for our own well-being too at the end of the day. And just some like summaries on what I'm hearing, like I love the quote about, yeah, we love data, but really it's about loving the people and being connected and fostering those relationships with the people. And I feel like student affairs assessment folks today like have to do so much in being rock stars. Like we have to be interdisciplinary, we have to connect, we have to be intentional about our influence across our campus and working with partners that don't report to us and really influencing them. And I think the managing up sometimes, you know, when our VPs or our leaders ask for information, like we are the experts. And so like, how do we share that without, you know, making sure that they get the point across? Because oftentimes they're presenting this information without us. And I know that that's something I've personally struggled with. And so as we all know, higher ed can be very reactive. The accountability movement is real, and the historical underpinnings of our work around like just trying to thrive and survive and provide data to show and justify why we exist has kind of always been looming. But we all know that assessment for the value of improvement and understanding is so important. And we're always trying to battle those kind of two tensions between like accountability and improvement. And so in terms of this environment we're all in, and I feel like the pandemic has exacerbated that quite a bit, what are some strategies to move from this reactive to proactive environment as a student affairs professional? And we'll start with Darby.
My first thought is to get on Amazon and buy a crystal ball, because that's what you need. And I have one that sits on my table because sometimes I feel like I get asked a question, hey, what do you know about this? And I think, well, we haven't looked at that. I didn't know that that was going to be something to look at. And if I only had my crystal ball, I could have said, oh, you know what? I need to gather information on this because 10 days from now, the VP is going to ask me this question. But in all seriousness, I do think it is knowing your environment and always understanding what's happening like seeing how things are changing, whether that's a change in leadership or a change in policy or a change in budget, whatever the case may be, then thinking, okay, how does that impact something else? What is going to be the effect on that? Or what is it if the institution says, we're going to focus on student success? Okay, what is student success? What does student affairs have to contribute to student success? How are we going to show that? How are we going to demonstrate and provide evidence that we have an impact in student success? That could be a whole conversation on its own. But I think it's paying attention to those things, knowing the literature, talking to your leadership about what questions are they getting from people outside of the division or the president. What are the things that they want to know to be able to talk about the Division of Student Affairs? And so continuing to ask those questions, trying to figure that out, trying to move forward, trying to look ahead. I think some of the things that you asked about improvement and accountability is I also try to frame it with our staff that if you're taking care of improvement, the accountability is there, that you're already committed to asking a question, collecting some information about that, figuring out what that means, doing something, and then saying, okay, is that working? Because that's what that accountability piece is. It just might look a little different, or you have to put it in a little bit different format for accreditors, for example. But I really think that it's always understanding what's going on around you to understand what the priorities are so you can take action and figure out, okay, this is data that I need to have.
And I'll echo the point about the crystal ball, because I think about this concept of future casting and trying to anticipate what's going to be happening on our campuses. And I think that requires staying up on the news. So reading Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education, every single day, even if it's just looking at the headlines, because that's going to help you think through what is going to be down the pike. But also keeping up on federal and state policy, because that also helps us think about what we're going to need. You know, I think back to 2006 and the Secretary of Education's commission, which really changed assessment in higher ed around accountability, but paying attention to that conversation. And then as soon as that report came out, reading that report helped me position our division better for this effort around accountability. And I had the same conversation that Darby mentioned. It's like, if we focus on improvement and really achieving our goals, the accountability piece will come. And so we don't have to be reactive. And I think, and as a faculty member now, I think the idea about staying up on the literature is really, really critical, because it's surprising to me how few administrators are aware of the current literature. I keep on giving this example when I was in a faculty representative on the institutional budget committee meeting about 3 or 4 years ago. And we're talking about the capital budget, and if we could move some money around and we'd save this pot of money, which we could put towards retention, which almost at every institution is something that we want to focus on. And then the senior administrators started brainstorming all these ideas about how to increase retention, none of which was based in the literature, none of it. And so, you know, knowing the literature on retention, I was able to say, you know, there's actually a whole field of research that can help us, you know, figure out how to do that. And so being able to pull out that research, you know, in meetings like that can really help make sure that your division, your unit is moving in the right direction, and really help inform other leaders in the division and the institution. And I think the final thing is just always being student-centered and really making sure to put students first, because that's why we do this work. Even though assessment people are not necessarily on the front lines and direct student service, we're the ones that can help make that happen. You know, especially now with the move towards equity-centered assessment, there's even more opportunity for assessment to have a huge impact, not on just students while they're here, but their graduation retention, which has long-term impacts for them as individuals, and also have impacts for society. There's a lot of research behind all that. So just keeping that in our forefront, and even if we have to be the ones that keep reminding folks that, you know, we're collecting this data, helps us provide better services, better programs to serve all students.
Wow. How can I add to those comments? I'll give it a shot though. Looking at things like retention, student success, graduation, keeping our students at the forefront. my dual role in assessment and technology benefited to a degree as people would have needs and they want to be able to demonstrate the impact their programs and services have on those issues. They wouldn't know what data to gather or didn't have access to that data. So I would kind of serve as a data maven to kind of pull people together with that common interest and need, pull the data together, organize it in such a way that they would get what they would need, but then at the division and institutional level, that could be aggregated up. So we got to develop systems which would grab at-risk data from students in their third and fourth week and be able to get that within minutes to the academic advisor if they triggered certain at-risk profiles. So it's a matter of listening to what people are wanting to do, and then looking at the literature to figure out what good practices or what good systems are out there to aggregate that information and then make that happen.
Oh my gosh, such great strategies. I really love the reframe. If we focus on improvement, accountability will be in place. I think that's a good reframe. And the future casting, like, I just feel like, again, I will say, like, every student affairs assessment professional has to be a rock star. We have to be able to do a little bit of everything. And this is why SAAL exists, right? First and foremost. And there are a lot of other communities of practice and different organizations that support student affairs assessment. But the reason behind SAAL is ultimately to build community and help this relationship building. So I just feel so humbled to be with you all who started these conversations in North Carolina way back when, and that we are still thriving as an organization and we're moving forward with our current strategic planning. So before we move on to our other question, there is a question from somebody in our audience around strategies. So what are some strategies for creating buy-in with colleagues who are overwhelmed by the idea of assessment? And we'll just start with Ted.
A lot of listening. Find out what is it that is concerning them or what is important to them. And then, given that we're supposed to be rock stars, we ought to have our fingers in different pots and our ears open in different departments, divisions of our institutions to be able to pull people together who have those common interests and needs.
Active listening, so powerful. Gavin, Darby, any thoughts on strategies for creating that buy-in when people are just overwhelmed by the idea and thought about assessment?
Sure. I hear that, have heard that for many years. And I think it is really providing that support and that okayness to say, this is not your dissertation. This is not a published research article in a high-level journal. This is about understanding what's important to you. And I think, honestly, I tell people, start small. So something that's manageable, something that you can integrate in something you're already doing. So it does not have to be so formal. It doesn't have to be a 50-question survey. It doesn't have to be extensive data analysis. It can be something as simple as a 1-minute paper on a 4x6 index card where you ask your students or participants one question that you can start small. And then I also say start with a win. So even though they might be overwhelmed, I think there are things that people do that say, I know this is good. Well, start with that. And again, start with something small and manageable. This isn't meant to be everything all the time. I also tell people, don't assess everything all the time. You don't have time to do that, and you don't need to do that. And particularly in these times of short staffing or whatever the case may be, it can become too overwhelming. So, kind of back off a little bit and say, what is it that I can do that is going to make a difference or a small difference or going to tell me a piece of data, a piece of information that I can do something with, and keep it manageable and keep it meaningful and keep it measurable. I think were things that Marilee Brashani has said many, many years ago that I also keep in mind. Assessment is supposed to help you. It's not supposed to hurt you or cause any more stress than you might already be under. So those are some of my quick, easy things I would say.
I have two related suggestions. One is thinking about helping people think about assessment as an investment. So I tell this story about many, many years ago. I was with my nephew because I don't have kids, and we were at a Chuck E. Cheese and we're playing that basketball game. So the whole goal is to get as many basketballs in the hoop in a minute. And, you know, even though my nephew was 10 at the time, I'm a full competitor and my goal was to win. We did the first game, and I did after I played that game, I realized the way I played the game is the way we do student affairs sometimes. Our head is down, focusing on the ball and just shooting up, hoping some things would go in. You know, I think we have a tendency in this field to throw a lot of strategies at a problem or try to fix something, hoping one of them sticks. But that's really not the best use of our time. And so when I was playing my nephew in the basketball game, I said, I'm going to take just a couple seconds, as soon as that buzzer starts to start the game, to do some assessment. So I realized that the ball was not fully inflated. Okay, that's going to have an impact on how I make the shots. I threw up a ball and realized it didn't bounce back. It just dropped because of that lack of air. And so I realized I'm not going to be able to bank the shots off and into the hoop. So I've got to get it swish. And so I changed my shooting strategy. So rather than looking down at the ball, trying to grab the balls as fast as I can, thinking that I've got to look for the balls, I was looking towards the hoop and shooting that. And so even those few seconds at the beginning of that 1 minute helped me increase my score and then beat my nephew, which is really the whole goal of that whole experience. But I think if we begin helping our colleagues think about the investment of assessment, we're going to be able to save some time, because nobody in student affairs has extra time, especially as we mentioned now with the pandemic, with short staffing. We got to find ways to cut that time, but also be more effective in that time. And so doing assessment helps us get to that. And then the related point is figuring out how to embed assessment into everyday practice. And thinking about, are there assessment techniques that we can use that actually foster learning as well as give us assessment data? So when I learned about classroom assessment techniques, probably 10 years after that book was written, that was transformative to me, to realize that there were these really easy things, and Darby mentioned that 1 minute paper, the index card type thing, that can give you really good assessment data in the moment. And then there's ways to scale that up if you want to. But those types of assessment techniques really help give some really useful information in the moment and in that point in time. So you don't have to send that survey afterwards. The surveys take time. They take time to build, they take time to put into the field, they take time to analyze, and you don't always need to do a survey. There are other assessment methods which will give you really useful information quickly. So really talking about folks about assessment being an investment, and then how to do that in an effective way by using classroom and learning assessment techniques to embed assessment into everyday practice.
Such powerful thoughts on buy-in, right? Is active listening, ensure that we're thinking about maybe whose voices aren't included, who we need to talk to. I love the idea that Darby mentioned, starting small, celebrating those wins. I really like the idea of assessment as an investment, right? Is the returns will come with enough. And I really like the everyday. One thing I'll add a little bit too, just based on what I'm hearing, and I hope that I'm very humble, but I think this is also really important. What I see in my work, doing this work for almost the last 15 years, is sometimes we want an assessment result. We want to know if we're doing things right. And I think that oftentimes our administrators want to see that long term, like, how does this affect retention? How does this affect graduation? How does this affect student success, whatever that means? But sometimes it's important to spend time as an organization. Are we doing the right things? Like, it's important to go through that strategy of, okay, why do we do this work? What matters to our students? What are their needs today? As we've all seen, and if we're following the literature, well-being is a big deal, even more than it's ever been. And so student well-being is very important. So are we doing the right things on our campus to address that? And just making space that is also assessment. And there's value in that process. And I think that comes up time and time again. And just to be mindful of our audience, because I just love this conversation, because for me, I'm exhausted. I don't know about you all, I'm tired. I'm overdue for a vacation, and it's just, this is really inspiring me and giving me what I personally need as a human. So thank you for that. So something that emerged earlier with the conversation is sometimes our administrators don't often know what's in the literature. They're not maybe following these trends. So if us, as doing our due diligence as a student affairs professional, maybe we find something, a trend, a need that we've identified, how do we upsell that to our administrators? What are some strategies for successfully influencing up for more support and more just overall getting attention for the specific trend that we're seeing? What are some strategies for that? And we can start with Gavin.
I think tying it right to what's important. So, retention, finance, those are big issues. Strategic plan are big issues. I think also getting people excited about the trend so that they can continue to talk about it. Thinking about I go back to the comment I said, and Darby mentioned this as well, is reading the literature. Not a lot of people, they don't have time to do that, and reading a journal article is a little intimidating. But I think there are ways to address that, especially since a lot of assessment people oversee professional development for their divisions, starting a book club of some kind where everybody will read a journal article and summarize it. So I only have to read one article, but I get the summaries from 20 articles because there are people in that group. And that can actually help identify some of those trends. And by having a structured or a sanctioned activity such as that will probably more likely grab the attention of people higher up in leadership, because it is something that's part of the fabric of that division. So those are just a couple off the top of the head thoughts I had.
Yeah, I think one of the things about knowing the literature, so good example from last week, my supervisor said to me, hey, I need some literature about reflection as part of learning. I'm sure you have all of that prepared in one place. And can you just give me some highlights of this? And I said, well, I'm glad you have confidence that I have that all in one place, which I had about 5 places. But then I was pretty quick to be able to say, well, this person said this about reflection and this article in this book, and here's what I said in this chapter of this book, or whatever. Because what he needed to do was really, again, summarize that for an audience that did not know necessarily the value of reflection in student learning. I knew what he was using that for. So I think that goes back to the importance of knowing that literature and be able to summarize it pretty succinctly. We did a staff campus climate survey, and rather than give him 50 pages of data analysis, it was a 1 page or 2 pages of here are the key things that I think that the vice president needs to know. Because the other thing is your supervisor or the vice president also may have come up through student affairs, but may not be a student affairs person actually at all. So they don't understand the concept of student learning and student development in the way that we do and the way that we approach things in terms of assessment. I think one of the things Gavin talked about, a book club, so my department, along with our institutional effectiveness department, had a non-book club, really, but it was about this equity-centered assessment. And once a month we met, and someone would put forth now that we're all on Zoom, like a conference presentation. So someone could watch this one session, might be an hour, 45 minutes, or an article or a chapter in a book. And then we would come together and talk about it. So I think how you engage people in that process and providing those opportunities, how they work. In terms of managing up, I have a fairly new supervisor, and I said, if you ask me to do something, you want, as he did today, he wants to send a survey to the division staff. And I said, I'm going to ask you questions. So I need to know, when do you need it? what the purpose is, how you're going to use it, because that's going to help me take the right action at the right time. rather than me thinking, oh, I'm sure he wants to know this or do this. And so I think it's always having that communication, and even ahead of time, and my boss came in, he said, I know I can't do your job. You do your job and you do it well. And I said, fantastic, but here are the things that I think you need to know, or how we're going to communicate in terms of this process. And then brand new vice president, not from student affairs, and understanding his perspective, and then how we manage that up too. So it's been fascinating. I think before we started this, we were talking about organizational development and how challenging it is. And it's always something is changing, which then changes the whole dynamic and potentially the direction of an organization.
That's amazing. Amazing advice. Ted, do you want to add anything, thoughts?
Yeah, even though I've been a couple of years out of the mainstream, I still do assessment work for the American Red Cross National Headquarters as a senior survey data analyst. So I'm still in the assessment arena. But one of the things I found helpful back when I was working full time was most of our assessment positions do report to the Chief Student Affairs Officer. And what was helpful for me was to understand what that person's day was, who they were meeting with, what information might be helpful to be presented to the boss to take to that next meeting. That person also has one-on-ones with the other direct reports in the division. What's percolating up to that person, who then we can then, as assessment people, figure out where we can put some of our skills and resources to effect. So part of managing up is understanding what the boss is all about, and what their day is like, and who they're meeting with, and what information might they need, or what can they pass along to you to help you do your job better.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh my gosh, these are so great. I like the idea of a book club or a non-book club, or just a space to be able to talk about these things, because I think it's important that, we're all trying to stay ahead and not, sink and still swim, that sometimes we may not have all the time to read like 20 different articles. I also like the Lumina Foundation. They do a quick kind of summary and a lot of articles, and that's super helpful for me. And I know there's a lot of other listservs that provide that as well. And I'll make a note. One kind of cool thing we had at my last campus, we had a pub club, which was not just focused on peer-reviewed publications, but any kind of publication, like a one-pager, anything that we would do on our campus. And we would meet at a local pub after work hours, and it was just fun, and it was a great community space. But something that that has helped me leading up with a lot of my supervisors of the years, because they're not assessment folks, they've literally come up through the student affairs and may not be familiar with assessment, and they may have done a graduate degree, but it just so happens my previous couple of supervisors have all done non-research degrees in terms of education. And so I feel like I'm always kind of like having to educate and train. And one of the things I usually do every meeting I have is I kind of give a quick summary on, like, on the national scale, here are kind of like 3 things that I see happening. On our local level, this is what we're collecting to understand that, and this is what we've learned. This is what we're not doing. This is what I would like to do. Does that resonate with you? Are you interested in that? Should we know that about our students if we're putting them first? And so it kind of just pings that back to why we do what we do. And so that's just been kind of helpful to me as a professional, kind of leading up with my supervisors. So I just appreciate you all being here for this conversation, because this is great. In terms of student affairs assessment, this is a discipline. We've kind of like all been pulled together. It's evolved, it's changed. There are a lot of resources now today to support student affairs assessment compared to what there used to be, 15 years ago. So to our panelists, where do you think the discipline of student affairs assessment is going? And we'll start with Gavin.
Well, I'm excited to see that it's really become a field with its own literature. I think one of the definitions of a profession is having a literature base, and I think we definitely have that. And the literature started with how to do that. And I think we're still doing a lot of that. And I think the next step in terms of the research around this is, are we having an impact? Because we're not necessarily measuring that meta impact. So I think we have to do some meta assessment, some assessment of our assessment, to really determine, are we having any impact on these bigger, broader goals, such as retention and student success? I think, and this is a no-brainer. I think to be a bigger focus on data analytics. And this really brings in Ted's background around technology, because the data that we can gather right now with the technology we have, not just in terms of Qualtrics and some of those other even assessment management systems will help us manage that. But even some of the really detailed analytics within our LMSs can give us great assessment data. Peggy Mackey's scholarship right now is around how do you can really use that real-time assessment through the data analytics and LMSs and use it for equity. So really trying to look at some of that, even when are students accessing content? How are they doing on the various assignments within the LMS, but then disaggregating that by various demographic categories. And I think we can mirror some of that in the outside of the classroom experience, because now we're collecting data on everything. When students are sliding their card to go in the rec center or to wherever they are on campus, we can really dig into some of those analytics and try to connect that with some of the other institutional data, since now we can connect all of those records in a data warehouse that Darby knows all about now, and really try to figure out what are the sense, what's really going on, and connect all those disparate pieces of data that were never connected before. And I think I also see this broader opportunities for collaboration across the institution between student affairs assessment, institutional effectiveness, and institutional research, which didn't exist before, which I think is exciting because students don't live these bifurcated or trifurcated experiences on our campus. They've got one experience. And so, but the way our institutions are set up, especially our larger, more complex institutions, they're all these discrete entities that aren't talking to each other. And because of that, we're not sharing that data across those entities for a lot of reasons. Sometimes the technology that exists, sometimes offices see information as power and they don't want to share that. But until we begin sharing that data, we're not going to have a full picture of any of our students. And so we're not going to really be able to help them as much as we can. So I think those are going to be some of the things moving forward, at least in the short term.
Need to click my unmute button. I think the future is bright. We're going to have challenges. We're all going to be pressed to the max in terms of how we are going to take our skill sets and then help our institutions and divisions along. But what I see is we're bringing more expertise to the table right out of our graduate preparation programs. Back in '93, when SAAL was going on 5 years old, we did a survey asking the membership where were their areas of expertise and how long had they been working in an assessment position and how long had they been in higher education. And there was a significant cluster of people who came to work in their current positions with a skill set that I could only dream about. Gavin's quote about we were flying the plane while we were building the plane was very true 20 years ago and even 10 years ago. I see with the building of graduate preparation programs with student affairs assessment as a core component of some of those programs, are people going to be able to get to a running start a lot quicker? And they're going to have a skill set, data analytics. I've got a niece who's defending her dissertation next month. And I'm killing myself because if I could have had a program in data analytics in 1990, that would have been awesome. But the technology didn't really exist in higher education back then. So again, I see the future is bright. I see our future assessment coordinator positions better connected, more sophisticated, and better prepared right from the start. So I'm looking forward to watching you guys.
Well, to add to something that Ted said about our preparation programs, so I teach in the first year, so I'm teaching our first years, ending our semester here in a few weeks, and they're getting ready to go off to their summer internships. And inevitably, at least one student will come back in the fall and tell me, one, how they use the assessment course in their summer internship program. But what is exciting and frightening at the same time is that at some campuses they go to, they're considered the assessment expert because they've had one semester of assessment. And that's exciting for them. And I feel fairly confident that they can go out and do fairly well. And then I think it's scary that that institution has not progressed forward. So I'm also hoping that more divisions of student affairs will be devoting resources to this area to have someone who's devoted to that, who has the skill set, who has the knowledge that can help others then do assessment in their division. And I think one of the other things I've been thinking about, in addition to what Gavin and Ted have said, is when we think about the assessment cycle and we get toward the end of the cycle, but it's not really an end because it's a cycle, but when we talk about sharing and using results, fairly recently, I've been really thinking about how student affairs assessment and division communication or departmental communication and the relationship with our development and fundraising areas, how those things are connected. Because I think a lot of our staff do assessment for improvement, which is great, which is what they should be doing, but they haven't taken that leap to say, what is it that we're communicating about our particular program or our department or the division of student affairs? As many of you might say on your campus, the division of student affairs is the best kept secret. People don't know what we do. It's because we're not telling them all the good things that are happening and what we do and how we know students are developing, how we know students are learning, and then thinking, then how does that relate to, if we're working with development staff in terms of fundraising and donors, what is it that donors want to know? And how are we also telling that story, which that phrase to me is overused, but I will use it, telling that story in a positive way to, again, enhance our reputation, to garner resources. And that's a different way to communicate than how our department is communicating with our staff about, here are the good things you did and here's some things you can do to improve, but how those things are becoming even more important when we don't necessarily have all the resources we want. We would like to have respect from our colleagues and our academic affairs folks and others on our campus, and how we then can use that in terms of messaging in a positive way as well. And so I think that's an area that's going to get more attention in the future as well.
Oh my gosh, such
And I
great
see Vince's
information.
comment.
Yeah, there's a lot here. I just appreciate everyone's comments. Wow, and the only thing I'll add around just the future, I really appreciate that sharing of information is closing that assessment loop, right? As we all know, it's dynamic, it's not linear, as humans are not linear as well. Our students are very dynamic as well as our colleagues. And something we started, actually, I heard from a SAAL colleague, so capitalizing on this whole SAAL network, they had done a metric Monday, and then we kind of started that within our organization. Well, I took that to my campus, and for almost 2 years now, we've done a metric Monday, even if it's just one metric from one study, and maybe one study will take us 20 weeks to share different levels of metrics. It's been helpful in sharing our story, what we're learning, and how we can improve that. And what I looked at our listserv a couple of weeks ago when I was asked to do that, out of our 83 members on our campus that subscribe to that, about 24 of those are from the development office. And I do get a lot of requests from them. So I just find that interesting. So again, networking and community building are very fundamentally important to the work that we do. It's important for multiple levels. Is we get to connect as humans, we get to collaborate. There's opportunities both professionally and personally. And it just helps us navigate the many experiences that we have across this world being rock stars. So I hope you all appreciated the words of wisdom that all our panelists shared today. I know that I did, and I really needed this. It's been a long week and it's only Tuesday. So we'll be sending out a recording to the SAAL listserv. And I'm just really thankful that you've joined us. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your words of wisdom around relationship building, around networking, and just really how to garner buy-in and really at the end of the day, bring that expertise to the table and really make a difference for our students and our campuses. So I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you everyone for your work on this. and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. And we'll look forward to seeing you all hopefully in future professional development offerings. Take care. Have a good one.
Thank you.